wow, this moment's actually here. For 6 months, I have thought about you people more than any other group that I've ever worked with. And in part, there's a certain pressure that comes from traveling 7,000 miles to get 18 minutes to speak. And there's a certain expectation I hold for myself, which is if I'm going to get 18 minutes and you're going to give me 18 minutes of your life, then I damn well better make them count. So when my wife and daughter were dropping me off at the airport the other day, I turned to my daughter, who's 5 years old, and I said, sweetheart, I'm going to be speaking to a group of young people in Greece, and they're going through a difficult time. What should I tell them? And she looks at me and she says, without hesitation, Daddy, just give them some magic. And then she pauses for a moment and she says, and if they can't see it, help them to see it. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do in the next 17 minutes that I have left. What I do for a living is steals from probably the great, if not one of the greatest stories that comes out of your history. Because when Homer wrote the story about a king going off to the Trojan War, he wrote this little piece in about how the king remembered that while he was gone, his son was still going to need to grow up. And he asked his friend, mentor, to make sure that his son grew up in his absence, made sure that he learned the critical life lessons. And so here it is all these thousands of years later, and this is actually what I do for a living, is I actually get to sit down with people and help them to grow up. And there's really 3 essential things that every single young person that I work with wants to be learning and doing, which is finding the right direction for themselves to go in life, finding the right people to be building their life together with, and ultimately finding their voice, how to be their authentic self in a world that makes it oftentimes so difficult to be real when there's so much pressure to conform to certain ideas or to certain stereotypes, but to find your own authentic voice. And in this work that I do, I have an idea about the idea of growing from a child into an adult. And so I'm going to ask you just to imagine a small circle about this big, because I think this small circle is the circle that most people live most of their life inside of. And it's a circle which is the circle of oneself. It's about I and me. And it's generally very short-term thinking. So it's about what feels good to me right now. How can I get what I want in the shortest time possible? And as people mature, the circle gets bigger. They start thinking about others than just themselves. They think about their family or the people they have commitments to, or ultimately how their actions begin to affect the world through time. And the way I see it is that for the last 30 years, we've been living in a world that's been dominated by many, many people who've been living their life inside of this circle, and we're living in the remains of it now. Because part of this whole thing about being a child or living inside that small circle or being an adolescent is that you live by these values which go, you know, I'm going to live forever, or somebody else will solve the problem, or, you know, things are just going to work out, or if things get bad enough, the grown-ups will come along and take care of everything. Well, look in the world right now, because what I see is a lot of people who may be adults but aren't necessarily the most grown up. And yet I see a number of people beginning to emerge with different ways of thinking and different ways of looking at the world. So last time I came to Greece, about 6 years ago, and I got to spend a weekend working with about 24 18 to 22-year-old Greek women who were all fascinated by relationships and wanted to learn how to find love and how to have the difficult conversations you have to build bonds. And I so wish that I could come in here today and just speak about that topic. But I understand that life circumstances don't make it so that that would really be the most useful use of your time or my time to be spending with you, because there's a lot of other things that are more pressing in your life right now. So while I understand many of you in this room may be young in life, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're young. And I want to speak to something that's at a very different level. In a way, I'm going to kind of go out on a limb, so to speak. And what I want to address, I think, is best summarized by a little story. A man named Charlie lives in the suburbs of London. He gets on the commuter train to go to work because he works in central London. And on the commuter train, he sees this girl. And he sees her for about a month. He's very attracted to her. And so Charlie's a bit of a shy guy, and it takes him that long to finally get up the nerve to walk up to this girl and say, "Hello, how do you do?" And she looks up at him and she says, "Excuse me, I'll tell you, I have a boyfriend. Now leave me alone." And Charlie's a bit stunned, but she definitely sent a very clear message. And he backs off and never says another word to this woman. But every day they ride the rails together. Almost 9 months go by. And one day, he has this feeling inside. And he goes, in spite of the fact that this woman almost bit my head off the last time I spoke to her, and she hasn't said a word to me in 9 months, though we ride the same train every day, I'm going to walk up to her and give a greeting. And it happened to be Valentine's Day. So he gets up the courage, he walks over and he says, Happy Valentine's Day. And she says, I'll tell you, it's a horrible day. My boyfriend just broke up with me and I'm all alone on Valentine's Day. But 9 months later, they were married. They're expecting their second child any day now. I'm not here to tell you a love story or about how somebody found their soulmate. What I want to talk about is, what was it inside of Charlie that told him this was the moment to go talk to this woman, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary? What was it inside of you that told you to give up your Sunday afternoon and be in this room today? What were the series of events that went on that led you to choose to be sitting next to the people that you're sitting next to right now? How many times in your life do you have this kind of experience where you walk in a room and there's just a person there and you know that you need to know that person? You can't explain why. I was sitting on an airplane one time and this absolutely stunning woman walks on the airplane, and I knew I needed to know her. Okay? She was a 75-year-old black woman. This is not what you had in mind, okay? I may be American, you're Greek, but there's some things that are universal, right? And she sits down next to me, and I broke my number one rule of air travel. I travel a lot, so I tend not to talk to people because I like my quiet and all that stuff. And ended up having this amazing conversation. Turns out that she was one of the early leaders in the civil rights movement in the United States. She marched with Martin Luther King, who was one of the really most admired and heroic figures in terms of bringing equality, especially racial equality, into the United States. Fascinating woman, had dined with the President of the United States 3 different times. And in the course of the conversation, she shares something with me that was one line that she said to me that actually helped me reshape my entire business. But that's not what really stood out for me. It was as we were coming into land at the end of the flight, she told me about how she'd been married for 50 years and had just celebrated her 50th wedding anniversary. And at the end of the at the end of her wedding anniversary, she said, I got up and I gave a speech and I made this list of 18 things you have to do to make a relationship last for 50 years. At this point in my life, folks, I was really good at making relationships last about 3 dates, okay? So I said, what were the 18 things? And she ultimately sent me the list, and I have that on my wall. My question is, who are you getting your advice and counsel from in your life? When you look out into the world and you think about all the different opinions that are being proffered, who do you take your advice and counsel from? There's so much data and so much information. How do you know what to be listening to? See, what came up for me in my instincts were to talk to you about instincts, about that kind of experience you have where, let's say, you wake up in the morning and there's a song going through your head that you haven't thought of in 6 months, and then you get in the car and all of a sudden that song plays on the radio and you go, that's just weird. You're in a bookstore and a book falls off a shelf and you put it back, and then you go up to the counter and the person in front of you is buying that book, and you go, that's whatever, and you go home and your friend calls you up and says, I'm reading this great book. You go, that's weird, it's 3 times in one day, and then you turn on the television and the book's being talked about. At what point do you start to take this stuff and go, is it just a coincidence? Or is there something more? How about the situation where, let's say you walk into a party, and a party that ordinarily you would just love to be at with the right friends, the right crowd, but this particular time you walk in and you just get a feeling inside that something isn't right. And yet, everything around you logically says, well, I should just go in the direction of be at the party. It must just be me being paranoid. And then all of a sudden, something really bad happens at the party. You go, it's so weird. I sensed it before it happened. Had I trusted my instincts, something might have been different for my life. But see, in the ordinary world, we don't generally talk about this kind of stuff. In fact, people who get up and talk about it are kind of, woo-woo out there people or something like that. But look at the evidence of your life. How many times along the way you just have this sense that there's something you need to know more about? Everybody else flips through the channels on the television and goes to the next show, but for you, there's one that you just need to study and need to learn about. Because I think for many of you in this room today, there's going to be something someone's going to say, and you're going to be fascinated by that idea. The question is, do you follow that fascination? See, it's one thing to be inspired, to feel good. It's another thing to commit to a life of following your fascinations. I think it's one thing to know what to do. It's another thing to actually be a person who will do it. So my instincts told me that I should tell you several different stories today. And I may bomb at the end of this today. I may go home and people go, I have no idea what that guy was talking about, but my instincts told me to tell these stories. And so I'm going to share these with you relatively quickly. Okay? The thing I realize, of course, is that at the end of this, somebody may send me an email 8 months from now saying, that story you told changed my life. It also may be that 10 years from now, when they actually invite me back to another TED event, I'll give a totally different presentation. It'll be amazing. People say, wow, how did you learn to do that? I'll go, because I knew that because I bombed the first time. See, because I look at it and I go, my instincts never steer me wrong, even when it leads down a road that's a difficult road. First story, a young girl, she's about 12 years old. Her name is Golda. She awakens into the world and begins to see the hypocrisies of the world. She sees the troubles of the world. She finds herself looking in the mirror and realizing that she's never going to be 5'10", 115-pound supermodel. She feels that she doesn't measure up to other people, and she becomes melancholy. So people start to give her all sorts of cliche advice. They hug her, and they tell her it's okay, and they offer her pills to take and all that kind of stuff. And her grandmother comes to visit, and her grandmother spends some time with her. And her grandmother pulls her aside before she's leaving, and she says, Golda, I have something that I want to tell you. You will always be needed. And Golda looks and says, oh, thanks, Grandma. And Grandma says, no. Listen to me. You will always be needed. Thanks, Grandma. No, listen to me. You'll always be needed. What you need to do is wake up every day for the rest of your life and go out there and find the people who need what you have to offer, and you will have an amazing life. This time, Golda heard it. When she went back to school, she suddenly stopped trying to be part of the popular crowd. Instead, she started hanging out with different people. When she sat in class, instead of just scribbling in notes in the margin, she began to question the ideas that were there. And Golda went on and lived an amazing life. And she gave lots of great things to many people. She found love in her life. She made great contributions to the world. And she lived to be 95 years old. And when she died at 95 years old, at her funeral, her great-great-granddaughter got up and said the one thing that would be the great legacy for any of us, which is the world was a better place because my grandmother, my great-grandmother, lived the life the way she did and gave the gifts that she had. Second story I want to share with you. There's a young doctor, comes out of medical school during World War I and is immediately sent off to the battlefields of France because his help is needed there. Now, he's a doctor. He's trained his brain, but he hasn't trained his muscle and his soldier attitude. And he shows up in the battlefields, and he's terrified. Every moment that he's there, the bullets are flying, the bombs are going off, and limbs of bodies and blood everywhere. And at one point, shortly after he arrives, his commanding officer sends him into the very front lines of the battle. There's a wounded soldier. You need to go all the way up, literally 50 feet away from the front lines where the worst battle is happening. And he forces himself to run out there, terrified, dives into one of the bunkers, covered in mud, sweating, pale. These two young soldiers look at him and they say, look at you, Doc, with all your brains, you were such a coward. Look how scared you are. This young medical student, doctor, looks up at these two tough soldiers and he says, gentlemen, if you were half as scared as I am right now, you'd have run for your lives a long, long time ago. Last story, personal one. Until today, I've probably told the story to 12 people. It was 1989. I was 21 years old. I'd moved to California, and I was following the breadcrumbs of interest in my own life. Those instinctual signals which told me, in spite of the fact that everybody discouraged me from doing it, I left school. I moved out to California. If you live in the United States, you'd understand what that means. Like for parents, they go, oh my God, they never come back. They moved to California, okay? And I was really, in so many ways, out of my comfort zone. The world was not working out the way I thought it was. Life wasn't the way I thought it would be, but I knew I needed to do this. Shortly after I arrived, there was a horrible earthquake. And in 45 seconds, the city was changed forever. Buildings were destroyed. One of the bridges collapsed. People died. There was a few days shortly after the earthquake in my street, there were some people living in one of the buildings, even though they weren't supposed to, and the building caught on fire. In the middle of the night, I watched them pull one of the bodies out in a body bag. And you can understand this was a very traumatic time to be living. It wasn't the life I thought I'd have at 21 years old. I come home one day, and I decided that I was going to take a nap. My roommates weren't home. And I lay down on my bed. It was cold, pulled blankets over me. And I have this dream. In the dream, I see the kitchen of my apartment, and everything is exactly the way I just left it. The dishes that I just had my lunch on were sitting there. I walked down the hallway. My roommate's cat was sitting on the pillow just where I had seen it before I went to take the nap. And I come to my bedroom door, and I open my bedroom door, and I see myself actually laying there taking the nap. And I go, whoa, what one of those cool dreams. Like, yeah, you know. And then all of a sudden it occurs to me, wait a second, maybe this isn't a dream. Maybe that's actually my body. And maybe this is like my spirit or something, and maybe I've died. And I become terrified because I'm 21 years old. I'm not ready to die. And all of a sudden, this voice comes to me, and the voice says, Jeff, it's not your time to die. You have too many people you need to tell things to, and too many things you need to say. Too many people you need to tell things to, and too many things you need to say. And in the dream, in that moment, I climbed back into my body, and I shot up awake, my heart pounding, my skin pale. Until today, I told that story to 12 people. I knew when I woke up from that dream, in the most far-out way imaginable, that dream wasn't the adolescent dreams that I'd been having up to that point in my life, because the adolescent dreams I've been having up in that life tended to be girls with hair about down to here who worked out at the gym next to me who I never had the courage to talk to. Or it was, you know, the Porsche 911 burgundy black top turbo. Those are the things I dreamed of at that age, because that's what adolescents do, is they dream about their own self-gratification and pleasure. In that moment, what I realized was this was the dream that life had for me, not the dreams I had for life. And this is the question that I would ask for you. And it would be the dream, the hope that I would have for you, is that you identify for yourself the dream that life has for you. Because it may not be what you thought it was going to be. But to be aware of all the different ways in which the signals get sent, all the different ways in which life tends to work out, even when you don't think it will. That little book that falls off the shelf, that song that keeps going through your mind and your friends tell you, just turn it off, I'm tired of hearing it. You go, no, there's a line in there and I need to keep hearing that line. That random stranger who you sit next to because you just felt you needed to, having no idea that when you sit next to them, that person could wind up becoming your business partner with whom you go out and you rock the world. Or you can just live life in the ordinary way and just go, it's all just a bunch of coincidences, it's just a dream, it's just whatever, got to get up, deal with the crap of life, the stuff that life's thrown our way. But that's the ordinary way. And what I came to do in the 18 minutes I had and the 9 seconds I have left with you is to offer you this one thing. Don't be ordinary in this world. Try to live in an extraordinary way, because who'd want to be ordinary in this damn world? Thanks, folks.